Hello and welcome to the Hole in My Heart podcast. This is episode 229. Let's get a proper theology of suffering.
Let's do that. We're going to do it today. Hello and welcome to the Hole in My Heart podcast, where we talk about how the gospel is good news for everyone every day. I'm your host, Lori Krieg, and we're coming at you from the WCSG radio studio in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I have alongside me my husband and favorite licensed therapist, Matt Krieg. Matt, how are you?
Hello, doing good.
Are you doing good?
Yes-ish. I don't know. You're asking me to know my emotions. Stop it.
In public. I was saying that because I know right before we started recording, Matt and I got in a little fight. Were we in a fight?
Tiff.
A tiff.
A kerfuffle.
I hope and I think that this conversation today is going to minister to our souls and help us to see each other in a proper relationship to Jesus. But on the other side, Steve, you're here too.
Hi.
Hey, how's it going? Do you want to be a part of our marriage fight?
Hi, guys. Sure. I mean, we should probably call my wife and just
work it all out together.
Yeah, work it all out.
I feel like we would just end up laughing together, which
Right.
is probably what we need. But Steve is our friend and the most professional radio voice among us. Are you in a fight?
Not at the moment that I'm aware of.
I love sitting with these avoidant guys next to me. I am apologizing early on for you guys having to be here, but I think it's going to be a great episode. In fact, we already recorded the conversation with Kelly Kapic, and it is on suffering, and it did minister to us. If you guys have ever been like, okay, suffering, schmuffering, or why did Lori say I need a proper theology of suffering? We are going to dive deep today, which will help us as we see each other through marital conflict or just being alive in 2024. We need to understand what's going on and how can we see God in each other rightly. We are talking with Kelly Kapic. Steve, who is Kelly?
Well, Kelly Kapic has a PhD from King's College, London, and is professor of theological studies at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia, where he has taught since 2001. He is a popular speaker and the award-winning author or editor of more than 15 books, including Christianity Today Book Award winners You're Only Human, and the book that we're focusing on today, Embodied Hope, a theological meditation on pain and suffering. Kelly and his wife Tabitha have 2 adult children.
I read his book, Embodied Hope, for a class at Wheaton, and it was so good. I have thought about it and quoted it, actually in the book I'm writing right now. But before we invite him onto the show, I've also thought about and appreciated our friends over at O'Neill Asset Management, where they helped us out when Matt and I were wondering what to do with our finances, with retirement. If you guys are also curious about what to do, you are welcome to reach out to our friends there at o'neillassetmanagement.com, where they're not going to judge you. They're just going to help you. So without further ado, let's welcome Kelly to the show officially. Welcome, friend.
Oh, it's so good to be with you all. Thank you.
We're so glad to have you here. We are going to start off with the question of the week, which I just told Steve and Matt. Oops. I forgot to ask the audience. I do this like once every 10 times. It just falls out of my brain. But we want to know it from you before we talk about suffering.
Yeah.
Ocean or space, Kelly? If you had one free ticket to explore one, which one are you picking?
Ooh, that's a tough one. You could make a good case for either. I guess I'd probably do ocean. I'd love to be down there, hang on to a whale and go for a ride. That'd be fun.
That's the dream. I always tell my kids, I'm like, because they're like, we just want to fly or we want to go deep to the ocean. I'm like, that. Do you think God puts that into our hearts and that's something we're going to be able to do in the new heavens and new earth?
Maybe so.
New podcast to conversation. This is where we're going now. All right, Kelly, we do want to hear your gospel story, just a little snippet of it. If part of the gospel is we're more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe, yet at the very same time, we're more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. How is that gospel first good news for you, and how is it still?
Yeah, great question. I get a short version. I grew up in a Roman Catholic family, but by the time I was I was the youngest of 3 boys. By the time I was in elementary school, pretty much all of us but my dad stopped going.
Oh, okay.
And my middle school years, as ridiculous as it sounds, it was during Breakfast Club and all that. My middle school years were like people's college years in terms of partying. And I became a Christian through this Baptist youth group my freshman year in high school. And it gave meaning to my life in a sense of, it took me probably decades to kind of look back and realize, but I think I was I just had this very real sense of I need to get everything out of this life right now because this is all there is. And I do joke because it's so weird when I look back. I was a kid who was partying and scrapbooking. Like that doesn't make any sense, especially as a middle school. You know, I was in California, but I as I look back and try to make sense, I think it was like I need receipts that I've gotten everything out of this world.
Yeah.
And I find it fascinating. After I became a Christian, I never scrapbooked, which I hope I don't offend your readers or your listeners.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
I'm not against scrapbooking, but for me, it was a liberation. Like, oh, there's something bigger. There's something more meaningful. And for me, that was part of the good news. It wasn't just forgiveness. It was like the ability to live this life, but not be crushed by it.
So how does that still influence your everyday today?
Yeah, in all kinds of ways. I think I love having purpose. I get to teach college students research and write, and I love meaning and purpose, but it is easy to try and do too much for me. And the most recent book I wrote called You're Only Human is kind of an exploration of no, the good of our finitude, the good of our limits, and embracing that. And I do think 30 some odd years later, that was kind of the fruition of me having some instincts early on, but trying to come to terms, in some ways relating to our conversation today, it's good to be a creature.
Yep.
Which is also why the problem of pain and suffering becomes important to think through.
Yeah. Well, and so in the book, Embodied Hope, you really talk about kind of this theological view of suffering, of pain, and being kind of this embodied creature. Why is it important that we as Christians have a robust theology of suffering?
Yeah, I just think it depends on your personality and your background. In many ways, I'm kind of responding to a couple extremes in the book Embodied Hope. On the one hand, is kind of evangelical, I don't know how else to describe it, kind of happy clappy, like everything's good, upwards and onwards. And, it's kind of a plastic Christianity, but kind of thinks that you're supposed to do it that way. And that's on one side. On the other, for those of your listeners who this means and things to, I'm a Reformed theologian. I work in the Reformed tradition. We have a high view of the sovereignty of God. But the problem is I've actually seen that go in problematic directions. So on one side, you've got the happy clappy, everything's good, which kind of lives in denial about how bad things are. And then on this other extreme, you start to have it like God is just this mad scientist doing all of these things. He has no compassion. It's just like he's just making things happen. And the way you think about suffering is just, you shouldn't think about it. You shouldn't feel. The goal is being stoic. And the Bible actually doesn't do either of those. The Bible's not plastic in terms of its view of the Christian life. And the Bible has lots of room for lament and struggle and question. And for me, that middle space, I hadn't seen really navigated well. So and just trying to go through some stuff ourselves, that became important.
Would you be willing to talk a little bit about that part of it? What was it that personally motivated you to research and write this book and develop that theology of suffering in your life?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. Unfortunately, most people don't write on suffering because of theory. And those who do, maybe actually, those that I've read, it's not often very good,
You're
unfortunately. Right. The very short abridged version, and I have permission to kind of share all this with you, but my wife, we got married in 1993. Long story short, she got cancer in 2008, and we had been married 9 years before we had kids. So the kids were actually relatively young, and she got a rare form of cancer. Normally, she was in her 30s, and it was a form that hits women in their 80s. And after about a year and a half, surgeries and stuff, she was declared cancer-free, and we thought, that was really brutal, but praise God, we got through it. Okay, that's our hard thing. And then the summer of 2010, she called me from the side of the road. She had just been meeting with pastors because of her work about some potential work in Haiti. And I only include that to say, like, she's doing God's work. Like, this woman should be blessed by God. And And she called me and said, I don't think I can drive home. My leg's not working. And that day in the summer of 2010 to this day, there's never been a day without pretty massive pain and fatigue. And it took us 6 years to get to the Mayo Clinic to get answers. And the answers, short version, are the two things she has. None of them, there are solutions. So pain and fatigue, and just that stuff is part of our daily life. So that's the short version.
So if you can put some of the puzzle pieces together for us, because in my line of work and Matt's, and really existing as a human in 2024, we encounter a lot of people saying, why? Why would God let me experience this? Why would he do this? And so I have, in my head, I don't say this out loud, but I'm like, your theology of suffering is off here. Can you help us? Like, can you put the pieces together that a proper theology helps to answer that grief lament?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is actually, I don't know why.
Yeah.
That's the honest answer.
Right.
And then after a fair amount of silence, then we can start talking, right? But it is how we respond to suffering does often betray a lot about our view of God. And like you said, having a good theology becomes really important in suffering. And like the extremes I mentioned, there are a lot of misunderstandings. You don't know how flimsy your theology is till you start to try and use it as a resource to live. And it's all of a sudden like you're trying to exist on saltine crackers. And you're like, no, I need some real nourishment here. And so all of a sudden a theology of suffering needs to pull on all kinds of areas people don't anticipate. Like, and you kind of alluded to this, like the doctrine of our bodies, why bodies matter, and the goodness of our bodies are really important. So even learning that there's something legitimate about asking why, I think is important. But maybe you're hinting at also right now, there's such a strong emphasis on why that arrogance can sneak in, and all of a sudden it's like God is under trial or something like that. Maybe you can say more about that.
I think so. I think I encounter a lot of prosperity gospel in people's hearts when they start asking the question why. Like, yes, I mean, Matt and I are going to Reformed Church right now. Like the stoicism, the celebration of suffering, that I'm just like the best Christian because I'm suffering so hard. Like that, we can see it. But
Olympic sufferer.
Gold medal. I think I encounter more, and Matt, you're welcome to jump in, more of a ramming ahead against, I was promised a good life.
I see what you're saying.
If I'm following Jesus, why does it suck so bad then?
Yeah, Paul Brand and Philip Yancey a long time ago wrote a book basically on the good of suffering. And part of what's fascinating, Brand was a physician who, and this was decades ago, early work in leprosy. And so part of the book is talking about kind of neurological things and can you imagine if you didn't feel pain and some of the dangers of that? But also one of the things he observes, and lots of others have observed this, that there is a strange irony where when you travel the world and deal with Christians and others, where suffering, physical, mental, other, war is way more than in the prosperous West, you tend to have far less of the very thing you're talking about. Whereas in the West, we have it so good that with anything, we just kind of hit the panic. And some of it is genuinely a need for some perspective. Having said that, I also want to take people in the West, their pain and suffering seriously.
Right.
So it's a tricky thing. Because I absolutely agree. I think all of us have some of that prosperity gospel in us. And so trying to navigate that's important.
All right. I'm sorry, guys. I'm dominating the questions here, but I got to ask this one because, Kelly, I posted about it. I had people say, what did you just post? This XY axis. I'm like, it's Kelly Kapic. His book is amazing. So I'm going to allude to, with the magic of radio, this XY axis that you can see if you go and read his book. It's on page 33. I'll just describe it. And then I would just love for you to just speak into it, if you wouldn't mind. So you say you have this XY axis, and it's high hope on one side, on the Y side, and then lament is on the other one. So we have hope on one, and we have lament on the X axis. And you say low hope, low lament equals detached stoicism. High hope, low lament equals naive optimism. High lament, low hope, unrelenting despair, which that's the one I contend toward. It's just right about the pain of life. Well, the hope for me was high hope, high lament equals faithful suffering. Can you speak into that?
It is an example biblically where we pick rather than allow the fullness of Scripture to speak into our lives. Right? So the Bible has all kinds of words about joy, hope, promise. And you can quote those to people and you'll be right. But the problem is when you quote those and ignore all of these laments, right? And that is where, like, when you're really emphasize hope but downplay people's genuine hurts and experience and truthfulness, you kind of end up in a naive optimism, and you just hurt people, often unintentionally, when they're suffering. Because it's kind of like, even when we were just talking about the danger of prosperity gospel, which I think is very real, when someone's really struggling, say, to pay tuition and some things have gone bad in their life, and they're like, well, that's just Western problems or something like that. They're like, well, it's where I'm living, but that's not the greatest example of suffering, but these things are real, right? And so it's naive to just be hopeful and not take serious lament. The way I would put it is, the reason it's actually offensive, because it sounds very spiritual, it's actually offensive to God because you're lying about the state of the world. Things actually aren't all good. People are dying. People are getting diseases. People are being betrayed. There is abuses happening in homes, and we need to not. It's actually super offensive to just pretend everything's good. On the other side, you do have and thankfully in the last 20 years, more and more Christians are, at least in the West, I mean, the rest of the world has kind of kept this, but has rediscovered the biblical emphasis on lament. Depending on how you divide it, 30 to 45% of the Psalms are lament. My God, why have you forsaken me? Where are you, God? Why are you allowing this to happen? And so that is brutal honesty. But when you learn lament, if you never get in hope, you just end up actually sad all the time. And I think what's remarkable about the Bible is, here's another example, like individual versus community. The Bible doesn't choose. And so the idea is you hold them both, and it allows you to live in this real world as you experience communion with God. Does that make sense? You want to talk about that more, maybe?
No, it's good.
Well, and so, okay, holding that tension is incredibly difficult. And as someone who is the opposite of Lori, I will tend to lean toward the bibbity boppin' and naive hope in many ways. When you're confronted with someone who is dealing with, let's say, not just like a finite feeling suffering, like a persistent suffering. It's something that my personality, I want to avoid it. Or if I want to lean into it, I'm like, I have no idea how. Like, how do I be with someone in the midst of their ongoing pain, because I feel like I should be able to change it, and I can't, and I don't like to be powerless.
Talking about chronic stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, momentary stuff is hard enough, but when you get to this place of like chronic pain, or pain where there really is no answer of, hey, just wait a week and your fever's gonna break, and when my kids have a cold, great, I can sit with them there, right? But with I don't know, with what you described, your wife, with the ongoing pain, with the ongoing suffering, when there isn't this easy answer where I feel like I can make an impact?
Yeah.
I guess how do you deal with that? Like, the expectation, the hope is that people will get better. The expectation is that, this will go on this upward trajectory of healing and everything. And when it doesn't, it's extremely uncomfortable.
Yes.
And I guess, how have you seen the church maybe worldwide deal with this, and how the Western church can maybe learn how to work with this ongoing suffering and attune to it and sit in and be present with it in a better way?
Yeah, I really appreciate how you put that. It's fascinating because, again, all of our cultures affect us, and those of us who are Americans, it's not just a male thing. It's an American thing. Like, we are fixers, right? And so if someone's like, I have this, our instinct is to try and fix it, and that's not always a bad instinct. But then when you baptize that instinct and make it Christian, this is where, again, you unintentionally hurt people. So someone's dealing with chronic pain or whatever, and a lot of well-meaning Christians, like maybe their prayer request or something, and next thing you know, you're being, and these aren't all hypothetical, it's not just like, well, you need to be gluten-free. It's like, literally, we've gotten, various juices sent to us from across the world where people are like, you just need to I've been given a verse from Deuteronomy and told to, chop up this much cabbage every day and drink it. And, all of this kind of stuff. And people mean well, but I always want to remind people, you're actually not, almost none of you are qualified. Early on, we'd go to the physician and say, hey, we were told about this. And they're like, oh my gosh, this, given your, and they talk about the numbers, and this makes this relapse more like don't do that. And it's fascinating. And you want to remind Christians, we have something to give that we're qualified for, but it's not medical advice. It's not an exercise regimen. We have Jesus, right? We have, and fundamentally though, that often isn't even just giving a verse. It's just being with people.
Yeah.
By genuinely sitting with them, loving them, not even talking about it a lot of time, but having a long view. By loving people over a very long haul, it makes it more believable that the Father is that kind and compassionate. So we actually make the gospel more believable by just being in that space. And even things like, and I don't know if this is controversial for some folks, but early on, people understandably like, we're praying for Tabitha's healing, we're praying, which is great. But honestly, we've been dealing with this so long. I now publicly say, like, I am happy for you to pray for Tabitha's healing. Please don't tell me about it. Because, and that really can offend people. But we've been doing it so long, often in the midst of that and other advice and stuff becomes, even if people don't mean it, there's this subtle, like, if you just prayed harder, or even just like, I had someone I love who, a couple of years ago was like, hey, there's this great deal on this medical magazine and I'm going to get it for you guys, once a month. And I actually said, please don't. Because it sounds nice, but now what you're doing is every month we get a new list of to-dos, and if we don't do them, then it's our fault that we're still dealing with this pain and suffering. Mm-hmm. So, so I said, you can pray for healing. Don't do it with us, because it actually kind of can be hurtful unintentionally. And just the last thing I'll say on that to help people understand, because I know how bad that sounds, is if someone is in a medical emergency and ends up having their arm amputated, do you still keep praying for them to have their arm? And everyone's like, no. Well, it is often our ignorance. We're not taking seriously the medical, words about, or diagnoses about what's going on when we just keep denying. So I'm happy for people to pray, but you have to keep in mind the people you're telling and who you're doing it with. Does that make sense?
Well, can I emphasize that? I have a sister with ongoing chronic pain. And she has said the same thing. she says, it's due to autoimmune stuff. She says, please don't tell me you're praying for me, or please just don't. I don't want you to pray over me.
Yeah.
And one of her things, she'll say similar things that you're saying, but she'll also say, I have settled with God that he is allowing this in me for my good and his glory. It feels like you are anxious and you're actually not okay with what God is doing in me. So I feel she like starts to feel responsible for like remedying their view of God, because they're like, no, it's not okay if you're not okay. And she's like, I'm okay. Can you be okay? And can you manage that between you and the Lord?
Yes. You exactly put your finger on what is so common. Although it sounds like they are anxious for you, for all of us, often what happens is we are anxious in ourselves.
Yeah.
It is making us, and I remember researching this book, and I was part of this Christian think tank, and there was a philosopher there, and we started talking about, and he talked about this idea of contagion. Not literally contagious, but there is this almost psychological thing. And so part of why we need other people in our groups to get better is because it so unsettles us and what it might do to our worlds. And that's what I mean about being honest about, this world is really hard. Again, this is partly why aging can be difficult for us. We're like, wait, why does my body hurt? Because I'm not 20 anymore, I'm not 40 anymore. So,
So it's like, man, if this can happen to you, to him, to his wife, this could happen in my life, and I'm not okay with that. And so it's, I wonder, like, I'm thinking about Job's friends, just as you were talking, I often come back to, I don't want to be one of those guys. Yeah. And I wonder if they were all like, hey, it must be something that's not right between Job and God, because everything's good between me and God. So that buffers me, or that somehow protects me. And I know you talk in the book about Job as like an example of suffering, and when God comes into the story, how he's dealing with Job is different. It's not a shameful kind of confrontation. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, Job is a fascinating example. Obviously when Christians and even non-Christians talk about and think about suffering, Job is kind of a classic text. And sometimes our familiarity with something can make it more difficult. So if you're at an undergrad institution somewhere, whether it's like Yale or Covenant College where I teach, it'd be very common for you in like a class on Western civilization to read part of Job. And what you'll almost necessarily read is the first 1 to 3 chapters of Job, and then the very end of Job, right? And it's interesting, in the history of interpretation, this has been one of the discussions, like what part of Job is most important? And in much of the history of the kind of interpretation, the emphasis is on the very beginning of Job and the very end of Job. And then in the 20th century, with the Holocaust, actually a lot of Jewish scholars all of a sudden said, oh, no, the thing that matters most about Job is the 30 plus chapters in the middle, which is fascinating. Now, obviously, if you ask me what's most important, I'm like, you need the whole thing, right? but part of it is we can miss it. Like, it goes on and on and on and on with dialogue and people saying things, going back and forth, and God just lets it keep going for a long time.
Yeah.
I always laugh. I have one of my colleagues is a fantastic Job scholar, and he and pastors always like, how do you preach through Job? Because part of what's so tricky is you'll have his friends' speeches in which they are basically saying things that are theologically correct, but when you step back, God's like, you guys don't know what you're talking about, you're wrong. And that makes it very interesting, because they're saying, in a sense, right things, but wrongly. And so you kind of have, this is the problem with Proverbs, is what we would call conventional wisdom. If you work hard, you'll be able to feed your family, right? If you sleep, But thankfully, the Bible doesn't just give us that. It also gives us Job, which is unconventional wisdom. And it's like, yeah, there's just stuff you and I don't understand. And you cannot make this a science kind of thing. So that's part of it, is to learn to honor both the beginning and middle of Job, where there is a lot of space for wrestling. And then in the end, you kind of have this encounter between Job and God. We can talk more about that if you want. But,
Yeah.
I want to hear more about that, because
yeah.
what you digested, and you quoted T.C. Ham throughout it. You said, I think I've viewed God, or I've heard his voice when I've read Job. Like, here's Job, and he's like, why? He's lamenting, but he's still like doing well. And then God comes in and he's like, yeah, so you're nothing and I'm everything. It's like it comes off as kind of condescending.
Yeah.
Can you help us understand what is God's tone, and how does he enter Job's suffering?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And, there's actually quite a bit of scholarly attention to this. And Ham's article is pretty detailed linguistically and otherwise, beyond what we could do. But there are a couple things just to kind of keep in mind that are an example, because that's how I read Job too, before kind of suffering. And it really, and you can see how we treat people who are suffering, like, read Job, in the end, understand you're just an idiot, suck it up. You don't know what you're talking about. And here's part of it, is there's something to that, right? As one scholar describes it in the, Job 42 and beyond, he says there is a gentle sternness to God. So there is something where God is like, hey, but it's not like, put it this way. Some scholars who don't see what we're going to be talking about here have argued God's just a bully.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair, like, so when Christians have this voice about God, step back and go, is that a God worth worshiping? Like, what are we talking about? But if it's actually, no, it is the creator. And there is a sense of like, hey, Job, where were you when I created the earth? Right? Where were you when I was working in the depths of the sea? Like, let's remember, I'm the creator and you are a creature. There is definitely a creator-creature distinction going on there, where God is saying, Job, but that's interesting. To say a creator-creature distinction, to say God is saying, just remember, you are very, very small. That is not the same thing as saying, you are very, very bad. And we hear it as very, very bad because we don't have a good doctrine of creation. We don't have a good doctrine that says even a small creature, and particularly human creature, really matters. So you get the creator saying, Job, you're a creature. But then you also have in Job 42, in a way you don't really have in the middle big sections, where this language of Yahweh, the personal name, the covenanting name of God, is used. That's very personal. Even the phrase that he uses, let's talk, come to me as a man, right? Which sounds condescending. But a lot of scholars have argued, and there's some linguistic things, but to argue, why are you taking that purely negative? It is more like he is showing the idea, like we miss it, the idea that the creator of everything comes and says, you're made in my image. We can have a conversation, right? Think about, put it this way. How meaningful is it to our kids when they finally get to an age where we take them seriously with conversation and don't just like, oh, whatever you say is great, but like, hey, we're going to have young adults respond so well to that. Not because you're saying everything they say is right, but also they're taken seriously. And that you could say is an analogy where God is like, come to me as a man. You're not a whale. You're not anything else. You're different, but you're also just a man. You're not God. So there is some of that. And then the last part, just to trim it down, is at the beginning of Job, at the end of Job, think about how God talks about Job. God really likes Job. And at the end of Job, God is like, this is my servant. And then he blesses him. And so it's like we forget that. God, the actual indicators, and that, so we don't have tone of voice in these things, so you have to look for indicators. And the fact that God's always describing Job in these kind of ways should tell us maybe we're misunderstanding the tone. And then you get to James, and James uses Job as a model of steadfastness. So Job is constantly this model for us when we don't often treat him that way. And so I think that is a sign that we've gotten some tone wrong.
Can I ask, because for me, that makes me picture God in my suffering. I feel a little more confident right now. Can you help, again, just to tie the dots together here? How does that help you? What you just said, picturing God that way, how does that help you as you process your own ongoing suffering?
It helps me because I, like most of us, have this instinct I actually need to protect God. And what I mean by that is, I don't, like, if you ask any of us, hey, does God know everything? We're all say, yes, of course, all those omnis, right? Omniscient and all that. But I think it's actually far more like the high schooler who has a pretty good relationship with their parents, but maybe went out drinking, did something bad, and is now going to have to tell their parents, right? So maybe they've been caught and it's going to come to the attention of the parents. Sometimes those teenagers don't want their parents to know, not just because they don't want to get in trouble, but sometimes they actually really love their parents and they want to protect their parents.
Yeah.
And they think it's better if their parents are ignorant about what's actually going on. And even though we know God knows everything, it is amazing how often we're trying to protect him from like some of the anger in our heart. Like we're like, I actually think God's just kind of a cruel tyrant, mad scientist, but I'm never going to say that because it's so bad. So we just keep it inside as if God can't see what's going on inside. And so I think part of what's remarkable, far more than Job, is the Psalms, and just encourage people to pray the Psalms, because the Psalms pray things that we never would feel like are appropriate. You know, if you're in a small group Bible study and during prayer time, someone's like, my God, why have you forsaken me? We're probably going to pull that person aside afterwards and like, hey, that's not true. God never forsakes you. But that's Psalm 22. That's Jesus on the cross. So anyways, the short answer is it gives me permission to be genuinely honest with God.
So can you offer some, I guess, level of encouragement to people who maybe feel like they are suffering in a more pronounced way? Just to offer that balance of hope alongside lament.
Yeah. I mean, the hope is that this gospel stuff we're talking about is not just pretend. And that this God is not, we say God is love and da-da. No, it's actually true. You have a Father that abounds with compassion. And God's love is so extreme. He takes your pain so seriously. Here's how I would put it, since we're just talking about Job. When you read the book of Job, one of the unsettling things when you're paying attention is God never actually answers Job's questions. He doesn't. The answer to Job's questions is God shows up and is present. But there's no like answers. Why this, why that? That's not the answer. The answer is God is present. You do not get the answer to Job's struggle for hundreds of years. And the striking answer to Job, which is the comfort to the listener who's suffering, is the answer to Job's suffering turns out to be that God actually becomes Job in Christ. That Jesus himself takes on all the suffering, all the brokenness. And so physical suffering, emotional betrayal, senses of being forsaken, all of it. We really do have a sympathetic high priest who, and I just think that is wild, but it's hard to experience it until you have the courage to risk and try it out with God and be brutally honest with him, enter into those spaces, and to discover that rather than flying off the handle or leaving you, he actually embraces you. And that becomes more believable by staring into the eyes of Christ. And that's beautiful.
Dude, Kelly, thank you so much. I know I received a lot from this. I'm sure everyone listening who had the ears to hear.
Well, thanks.
Ministered to. Thank you.
Great to be with you guys.
As we wrap things up, I do want to give one more shout out to O'Neill Asset Management for sponsoring us today. His team has helped us as we have navigated our financial situation. What do we do about retirement? He doesn't exactly help with budgeting, but because they help us think about long-term goals, Matt can more easily equip us with proper budgeting. If you want a non-judgmental complimentary analysis of your finances, visit o'neillassetmanagement.com. It's in the show notes too. All right, Matt, I'm starting with you. We say goodbye to Kelly. And now I'm going to ask you, what did you think about what he said on suffering?
A lot. I think the talking about Job and God's, like, looking for those like pinpoint moments of God giving affirmation to Job in the midst of the hey, you weren't here when I made everything. Still that ontological difference, still a creature creator dynamic, but like just that notion that God really likes Job. Kind of brought up in me that is hard for me to accept, that God may really like me. And so I don't feel like I view God as the mad scientist, but maybe just always like busy doing his own thing. And so I think that's kind of just hitting me right now.
I'm sure we'll follow up and talk about that on another date night or something, or not to pressure you. Eek. I like you, Matt. Steve.
Well, I can relate to that as well, Matt. So maybe when the four of us go out,
yeah, there we go.
Spend all our time talking about that. But actually, I was also really impacted by what Kelly said about how to be with people who are in the midst of suffering of whatever kind, and how not to, like how to not just be a Western fixer, because I feel that in myself, and just how that tied into all the space that there is in the book of Job for just wrestling through it, and that we can just be a kind witness to people who are in that place. So, yeah.
That just reminded me what you just said. When you were talking about how when you're walking with people in ongoing suffering, which is your job as a therapist, I think I can view you, Matt, as someone who's super good at walking with people who have ongoing chronic soul pain or physical pain. But it even helped me to be like, oh, even Matt struggles with that, because you're like, I just want to fix it. And I was like, oh, I also want to fix it. And then Kelly was like, me too. So that was a helpful camaraderie moment of we're all humans here. And then even Kelly saying to that desire, when I asked, what's up with suffering? He's like, I don't know.
God no answers.
But God does know.
Right.
And there is a sweetness in that. Okay, guys, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Those of you who are listening, what do you think about the suffering? Let's get a proper theology of suffering today. You can email me at podcast@lorikrieg.com, or you can find us on the Hold My Heart podcast Facebook group. We do have a question of the week for next time. What was your youth group name? Neon, Element, Life, Elevate. Do you know, Steve? Did you have a youth group name?
I'm so old. My youth group name was Youth Group.
Yeah.
I'm going to youth group tonight. We didn't have a cool name for it. I remember. I can't remember it. But I had a buddy who had a college group, and he had a name for it. I was like, "What? What's the?" And it worked, because I was like, "I want to go to a thing with a name."
Yeah,
so
it did work. It probably still works. What were you, Matt?
The Well.
Yeah, there it is.
There it is. The Well. Yes.
There's a lot of wells out there, and I still like them. If you guys want to let us know, you can join the Hold My Heart podcast Facebook group, where When I remember, I post the question, and I like to hear your answers. If you like this podcast, if you wouldn't mind taking a minute to rate and review it, it helps others to find it. But for now, as we close, I do want to give a big thank you to Kelly Kapic for joining us today. Thank you to WCSG for hosting us, and O'Neill Asset Management for sponsoring the Zach of all trades, for making everything work. And for all of us here at the Whole My Heart Podcast, we'll see you next time.